Imagine you're sitting in prison for 20 years, convicted of sex trafficking children, despised by the entire world, and then suddenly you realize you hold the one piece of information that could either save or destroy the most powerful man on earth. So you make a calculated gamble. You tell Congress, I know secrets that will prove Donald Trump is completely innocent of everything related to Jeffrey Epstein, secrets that only I possess, secrets that will change history. But I'm not saying a word unless the President of the United States personally sets me free. And this isn't some fantasy. This actually happened yesterday when Ghislaine Maxwell appeared virtually before the House Oversight Committee from her Texas prison cell, invoked the Fifth Amendment on every single question, refused to name a single co-conspirator, refused to admit she even knew Epstein was abusing children, and through her lawyer made the most brazen offer in congressional history: clemency in exchange for testimony that clears Trump. And now Trump faces an impossible choice that will define his presidency. Does he free a monster to save himself, or does he refuse and risk Maxwell flipping and exposing secrets that could annihilate him? And every second he delays, the pressure builds. Survivors are begging Congress not to cave. Lawmakers from both parties are calling this extortion. And you're about to witness the most twisted political hostage situation America has ever seen. Let me take you inside what actually happened yesterday, on Monday, February 9th, 2026, in one of the most stunning congressional hearings in modern American history, because Ghislaine Maxwell, who is currently serving a 20-year federal prison sentence at a minimum security facility in Bryan, Texas, for her conviction on sex trafficking charges related to her role in recruiting and grooming underage girls for Jeffrey Epstein's abuse, appeared virtually before the House Oversight Committee for a closed-door deposition that lawmakers had been trying to schedule for months. And this deposition was supposed to be the centerpiece of Congress's investigation into the Epstein scandal, because Maxwell is the only other person besides Epstein himself who was ever charged and convicted in connection with this massive child sex trafficking ring that operated for decades and involved some of the most powerful and wealthy people in the world. And Epstein is dead. He allegedly killed himself in a Manhattan jail cell in August 2019 while awaiting trial, although conspiracy theories about his death persist. So Maxwell is literally the only living person who can provide firsthand testimony about what happened, who was involved, how the operation worked, how many victims there were, and whether there were other co-conspirators who have never been held accountable. And the House Oversight Committee, led by Republican Chairman James Comer from Kentucky, has been conducting this investigation for months. They've been releasing millions of pages of documents from the Justice Department related to Epstein. They've been subpoenaing witnesses, and they've been building toward this moment when they could finally question Maxwell directly. And survivors of Epstein's abuse have been waiting for this too, hoping that Maxwell would finally be forced to tell the truth and name names and provide accountability. And the committee had subpoenaed Maxwell back in July 2025, 7 months ago. But Maxwell's lawyers kept stalling and negotiating, and there were questions about whether she would even appear. But finally, a date was set for February 9th, 2026, and Maxwell appeared virtually from prison, sitting at a conference table wearing a brown prison-issued shirt with a bottle of water in front of her. And the video of her deposition has now been released publicly, so we can see exactly what happened. And what happened was absolutely jaw-dropping, because Maxwell's attorney, David Oscar Marcus, started by reading a prepared statement to the committee. And in that statement, he explained that Maxwell would not be answering any questions, that she would be invoking her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination on every question. And the reason he gave was that Maxwell currently has a habeas petition pending in federal court in New York, where she's trying to overturn her conviction. And she claims her trial was fundamentally unfair because jurors lied during jury selection to get on the jury, and because the government allegedly promised her immunity and then broke that promise. And Marcus said that newly disclosed documents prove these facts conclusively, and therefore Maxwell couldn't testify without potentially hurting her legal case. But then came the bombshell. Marcus said, quote, "If this committee and the American public truly want to hear the unfiltered truth about what happened, there is a straightforward path. Ms. Maxwell is prepared to speak fully and honestly if granted clemency by President Trump. Only she can provide the complete account. Some may not like what they hear, but the truth matters. For example, both President Trump and President Clinton are innocent of any wrongdoing, Ms. Maxwell alone can explain why, and the public is entitled to that explanation. End quote. And let's just pause there because this statement is absolutely extraordinary. Maxwell is saying through her lawyer that she has information that proves both Donald Trump and Bill Clinton are innocent of any wrongdoing related to Epstein, but she's refusing to share that information unless Trump grants her clemency and releases her from prison. And this is textbook extortion. She's holding information hostage and demanding payment in the form of her freedom. And it's not even subtle. She's doing it openly in a congressional hearing. And then the questioning began, and committee members asked Maxwell a series of questions. Very basic questions like, were you aware that Jeffrey Epstein was sexually abusing minors? And did you participate in the sexual abuse of any minor? And can you provide the names of any additional co-conspirators? And to every single question, over and over again, Maxwell said the exact same thing. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right to silence. That's it. Nothing else. Just that one sentence repeated robotically more than a dozen times. And she didn't elaborate. She didn't explain. She didn't show any emotion. She just invoked the Fifth over and over. And after less than an hour, the deposition was over. Maxwell had provided zero new information, zero cooperation, zero accountability. And the reactions from lawmakers were immediate and explosive. Chairman James Comer came out of the deposition and told reporters, quote, as expected, Ghislaine Maxwell took the Fifth and refused to answer any questions. This is obviously very disappointing. We had many questions to ask about the crimes she and Epstein committed, as well as questions about potential co-conspirators. We sincerely want to get to the truth for the American people and justice for survivors, end quote. And Comer made it very clear where he stands on Maxwell's clemency demand. He said, quote, initially, she had asked that the Oversight Committee grant immunity. And when we met with the survivors of Epstein, it was pretty clear that Maxwell was a very bad person and she committed a lot of crimes. So I personally don't think she should be granted any type of immunity or clemency, end quote. And Democratic members were even more forceful in their condemnation. Representative Melanie Stansbury from New Mexico said, quote, she is telling Donald Trump through her deposition that she is trying to buy her clemency. This is all strategy for her to try to get a pardon from President Trump, and she's never shown any remorse for the victims in this entire case, end quote. And Representative Suhas Subramaniam from Virginia pointed out a very suspicious inconsistency. He noted that Maxwell invoked the Fifth during this congressional deposition, but she did not invoke the Fifth when she met twice last year with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche, who is a Trump appointee, and Subramaniam said, quote, this position appears inconsistent with Ms. Maxwell's prior conduct, as she did not invoke the Fifth Amendment when she previously met with Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche to discuss substantially similar subject matter, end quote, which raises the obvious question, why was Maxwell willing to talk to Trump's Justice Department but not willing to talk to Congress? And what did she tell Blanche in those meetings? And is there already some kind of deal in the works? And this is where things get really suspicious because just days after Maxwell met with Blanche last summer, she was suddenly transferred from a higher security prison in Florida to a minimum security prison camp in Texas. And the official explanation was that there were numerous threats against her life, although no details were provided. But Democratic lawmakers immediately questioned whether Maxwell had been given special treatment in exchange for political favors. And those questions look even more relevant now, given that Maxwell is publicly campaigning for clemency from Trump, and Representative James Walkinshaw from Virginia captured this perfectly when he said, quote, what we did get was another episode in her long-running campaign for clemency from President Trump. And President Trump could end that today. He could rule out clemency for Ghislaine Maxwell, the monster. The question for all of us today is, why hasn't he done that? End quote, and that's the key question. Why hasn't Trump just categorically ruled out clemency for Maxwell? It would be so easy. He could issue a statement saying, I will never pardon or grant clemency to Ghislaine Maxwell, a convicted sex trafficker. And that would end this whole controversy. But he hasn't done that, and his refusal to rule it out is deeply suspicious and suggests that he's at least considering it. And meanwhile, survivors of Epstein's abuse are absolutely horrified by what's happening. Before Maxwell's deposition, a group of survivors sent a letter to the House Oversight Committee urging them to treat Maxwell's testimony, quote, with the utmost skepticism, end quote, and warning them not to grant any form of immunity or clemency. And in that letter, which was obtained by NBC News and entered into evidence during the deposition, the survivors wrote, quote, Ghislaine Maxwell, you were not a bystander. You were not misled. You were a central, deliberate actor. In a system built to find children, isolate them, groom them, and deliver them to abuse. You used trust as a weapon. You targeted vulnerability and turned it into access. That is not a mistake. That is not poor judgment. That is predation." End quote. And the survivors ended their letter with a quote from Virginia Giuffre, one of the most prominent Epstein victims, who said, quote, "Ghislaine, you deserve to spend the rest of your life in a jail cell, trapped in a cage forever just like you trapped your victims." End quote. And these survivors are begging Congress and begging the president not to let Maxwell manipulate the system again, not to let her trade information for freedom, not to give her any kind of deal because she doesn't deserve it. She's a monster who destroyed lives, and she should serve every single day of her 20-year sentence. But Maxwell and her lawyer are betting that Trump cares more about protecting himself than about justice for victims, and they might be right. Because here's the thing, Trump is in an absolutely impossible position, and Maxwell knows it, and she's leveraging that to try to get herself out of prison. So let's break down Trump's options and why each one is terrible. Option 1, Trump grants Maxwell clemency. He signs the papers, he sets her free, and in exchange, Maxwell testifies before Congress and presumably tells some story about how Trump never did anything wrong with Epstein, how Trump was actually a great guy who cut ties with Epstein as soon as he found out about the abuse, how the photos and videos of them partying together were taken out of context. Whatever story Maxwell wants to tell to exonerate Trump, and maybe Maxwell's testimony would help Trump politically, maybe it would quiet some of the speculation and accusations, but the cost would be catastrophic. First, Trump would be freeing a convicted child sex trafficker from prison, someone who a jury unanimously found guilty of conspiracy to entice minors to engage in illegal sex acts, of sex trafficking conspiracy, and of sex trafficking of a minor, someone who the judge at sentencing said was a central figure in a horrific scheme that involved multiple victims over multiple years. And Trump would be letting her out of prison early for purely selfish reasons, to protect his own reputation, and the political fallout would be devastating. Democrats would hammer him relentlessly. They would run ads showing Maxwell walking free and asking, "Donald Trump freed a child sex trafficker to save himself." What kind of president does that? And even many Republicans would be disgusted. You're already seeing Republicans like Representative Thomas Massie tweeting things like, "No clemency, you comply or face punishment," in response to Maxwell's offer. So Trump would lose support from his own party, and survivors would be traumatized all over again seeing the person who abused them walking free, and the moral stain would be permanent. Trump would forever be known as the president who pardoned a sex trafficker. And beyond the political damage, there's a legal question of whether this would even be legal. Because if Trump grants clemency to Maxwell in exchange for her providing testimony that benefits him, that could potentially be obstruction of justice or bribery. It's a quid pro quo where Trump is using his presidential powers to obtain something of personal value, and that's exactly the kind of corrupt bargain that the law prohibits. So option 1 is politically suicidal and potentially criminal. But option 2 is maybe even worse. Option 2, Trump refuses clemency. He says no. He tells Maxwell she's staying in prison. And then what happens? Well, Maxwell has made it clear that she has information. And if she can't get clemency from Trump, she might decide to flip. She might decide to tell everything she knows to prosecutors or to Congress or to journalists. And she might not be so charitable to Trump in that testimony. She might reveal damaging information about Trump's relationship with Epstein, about what Trump knew, about what Trump did, about who else was involved. And remember, Maxwell was Epstein's closest associate for decades. She was his girlfriend, his business partner, his madam. She knows everything. She was there for all of it. She has firsthand knowledge of every party, every trip, every person who came to Epstein's properties. And if she decides to talk without the incentive of clemency, she has no reason to protect Trump or anyone else. And the information she could reveal could be absolutely devastating. It could end Trump's presidency. It could lead to criminal charges. It could destroy his legacy forever. So refusing clemency means risking that Maxwell becomes Trump's enemy instead of his ally. And that's terrifying for Trump. And this is why Maxwell's offer is so diabolical. She's created a situation where Trump loses no matter what he does. If he helps her, He's morally compromised and politically damaged. If he doesn't help her, he's potentially exposed to catastrophic revelations. It's a perfect extortion scheme, and Maxwell is playing it brilliantly from prison. And the really disturbing thing is that this whole situation reveals something dark about Trump's relationship with Epstein. Because if Trump truly had nothing to hide, if he really was completely innocent of any wrongdoing related to Epstein, then Maxwell's testimony wouldn't matter. He could just say, "I don't need Ghislaine Maxwell to clear my name. The facts speak for themselves. I barely knew Epstein. I cut ties with him years ago. Release whatever information you want. I have nothing to hide." But that's not what's happening. Instead, Trump is staying silent on the clemency question. He's not ruling it out. He's leaving the door open. And that suggests that he's worried about what Maxwell might say if she doesn't get what she wants, and that should concern every American. Because if the President of the United States can be blackmailed by a convicted sex trafficker, what does that say about his judgment, his character, and his fitness for office? So where do we go from here? Because this story is far from over. In fact, it's just beginning. The House Oversight Committee investigation continues. They have 5 more depositions scheduled in the coming weeks, including Leslie Wexner, the billionaire retail mogul who was Epstein's biggest financial client, on February 18th, and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, who have agreed to testify after initially refusing and facing contempt of Congress proceedings. Bill Clinton is scheduled for February 27 and Hillary Clinton for February 26. And there's also Epstein's accountant and lawyer who are expected to testify. So more information is going to come out, more names might be revealed, more connections might be exposed, and all of this is happening while millions of pages of Epstein-related documents are being released by the Justice Department, and members of Congress are now able to view unredacted versions of these files, which could contain even more explosive information. And Trump's Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is already facing calls to resign because documents show he lied about his relationship with Epstein, so the scandal is spreading and touching more and more people in Trump's orbit. And the pressure on Trump regarding Maxwell's clemency offer is going to intensify. Every day that goes by without Trump categorically ruling out clemency is another day that people will speculate about what he's hiding and what deal might be in the works. And if Trump does grant clemency to Maxwell, the backlash will be swift and severe. There will be protests. There will be calls for impeachment. There will be investigations into whether the clemency was corrupt, and Trump's presidency could enter a terminal phase. But if Trump doesn't grant clemency and Maxwell decides to talk, then we could see revelations that make everything we've seen so far look tame by comparison, because Maxwell knows where all the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. She knows who visited Epstein's island, who flew on his private jets, who attended his parties, who participated in abuse, who knew about the abuse and did nothing. And if she starts naming names and providing details, it could bring down not just Trump, but potentially dozens of other powerful figures. And that's what makes this situation so dangerous and so unprecedented. We've never seen anything like this before. A convicted sex trafficker holding the most powerful people in the world hostage with the threat of exposure and using the promise of exoneration as currency to buy her freedom. And the survivors in all of this are the ones who continue to be victimized because they're watching the person who abused them try to manipulate the system yet again, try to escape consequences yet again, try to trade on her knowledge and her connections yet again. And it's traumatic and it's infuriating and it's unjust. And this is why it's so important that Trump make the right choice. Here, he needs to stand with the victims. He needs to refuse clemency. He needs to let justice be served, even if that means risking his own reputation, because doing the right thing sometimes requires personal sacrifice. And if Trump can't do that, if he puts his own interests above the interests of survivors and above the interests of justice, then he's not fit to be president, and the American people deserve better. And finally, this whole situation should make us ask deeper questions about power and accountability in America, because the Epstein scandal isn't just about one man or even two people. It's about a system that allowed powerful men to abuse vulnerable girls for decades without consequences. It's about how wealth and connections can shield people from accountability. It's about how victims are often ignored and dismissed while predators are protected. And until we fundamentally change that system, we're going to keep seeing scandals like this. We're going to keep seeing powerful people exploit the vulnerable. We're going to keep seeing justice denied. So yes, the immediate question is what Trump will do about Maxwell's clemency offer. But the bigger question is what we as a society are going to do to ensure that people like Epstein and Maxwell can never operate with impunity again, and whether we're going to prioritize protecting the powerful or protecting the vulnerable. And that's a choice that every American needs to make, not just Trump, because this scandal belongs to all of us. And how we respond to it will define who we are as a nation.